Hey, what's up everyone? So today we're going to talk about Fox News, the Iraq War, and PMCs, or private military contractors, which is a fancy way of saying mercenaries. They are guns for hire that are deployed all around the world, especially by the United States. Hiring a company to send armed mercenaries tasked with, for instance, protecting a convoy in an occupied country instead of official soldiers has several benefits. Firstly, it doesn't really matter how long their mission takes or how many of them die during that time, since these casualties don't have to be reported, and also the average population doesn't care as much about people whose sole motivation is money. Because of this, the government can lower the risk of major backlash against an ongoing military involvement like at the end of the Vietnam War. This practice also has significant downsides though, like lowering the morale of official soldiers, since it's not rare that PMCs get 3 or 4 times the average salary of a regular US soldier for doing a similar job. Another drawback is that a lot of them act like drunken frat boys with guns. For instance, in late December 2006, a very drunk private military contractor left a Christmas party and somewhere through Baghdad's Green Zone, eventually encountering a bodyguard of the Iraqi vice president. Some argument ensued and the military contractor pulled out his gun and killed the bodyguard. A bit earlier than that, in November 2004, 2 private contractors were tasked with delivering a couple of US military officials to some location in Afghanistan. A later investigation showed the 2 pilots deliberately flying the non-standard route low through the valley for fun. Now, the airplane they used for this job had a cockpit voice recorder installed, so we have a transcript of what was said inside the plane. For instance, "Yeah, this is fun," and "Yeah, you're an X-Wing fighter Star Wars, man," as well as "I swear to God they wouldn't pay me if they knew how much fun this was." That last sentence being the literal last sentence of the pilot in charge before the airplane crashed into a mountain range, killing all 6 passengers. The contractors used in these 2 examples were employed by the company Blackwater. More on these guys later. Now, what does this have to do with the American news network Fox News? Well, firstly, Fox News is a disgraceful hate-for-profit racket with no redeeming qualities. This is not going to be one of those videos where I pretend that there are 2 legitimate sides to an issue, because there aren't. While all for-profit media is biased in some form or another, they are not all equally as biased. Fox News at this point in 2019 for the most part only serves the agenda of the Republican Party to distract their base with nonsense like kneeling football players or whipping up white racial panic, so they don't pay too much attention to the Republicans' real agenda, which is of course serving the mega wealthy. It's also the reason your uncle can't stop talking about Hillary Clinton selling uranium to Russia over Thanksgiving dinner, while you sit there in silence, trying to remember the good times you had together before Fox News and Facebook melted his brain. I think this clip sums the network up nicely.
We saw in Charlottesville were fringe fanatics who don't represent this country. America is not a racist nation. It's time we stop acting like it is. All right, not sure what we're going to do next, but we have a great show. Listen, are Maxine Waters and Susan Rice siding with North Korean dictator? We'll debate it next. And later, guys with guns threatening President Trump over food stamps.
There are a bunch of things one can criticize Fox News for, hosting Tucker Carlson's White Power Hour 5 times a week surely being very high up on the list, but from time to time they outdo themselves. Over the last couple of months, there have been multiple appearances on Fox News by 2 people named Gina Keating and Michael Flaherty, who just launched a podcast called Raven 23, Presumption of Guilt. But before we go any further, I should clarify that this is about much more than some shitty podcast. After seeing this segment, I fell down a rabbit hole and it turns out this segment is much more relevant to current politics than you might initially think. Anyway, let's take a look.
Back in 2007, 4 Blackwater contractors were tasked with defending American diplomats at the height of the Iraq War. Remember, 2007, dangerous times. The men were found guilty of killing Iraqi civilians, but they maintained their innocence, saying they were ambushed. Our next guests are telling the Blackwater story in the podcast, the brand new podcast out today, Raven 23, Presumption of Guilt. The creators and producers, Michael Flaherty and Gina Keating, join us now. Thank you both for being here. I've learned a lot about this story. Listen, this show's covered Eddie Gallagher, Matt Goldstein, Clint Lawrence, guys in prison for things, for questionable situations. This one's as bad as it gets.
So it's pretty clear what Fox News presents this as. 4 guys questionably imprisoned for actions committed overseas. The real meat of this segment comes when one of the producers attempts to explain what these guys have been prosecuted for.
Explain what happened. Raven 23 is the call sign of these 4 contractors. What happened in Iraq that day?
They were called to clear a route so that a diplomat who was at a location that had just been bombed could come through and go safely to the green zone.
So that person had just been bombed, and they're evacuating.
Exactly.
And this is in September, when there was an average of 2 attacks a day, and they had developed a great new technique where they would detonate a car bomb, people would swarm to go protect people, and then they would ambush them.
Secondary ambush.
Exactly. So they get to this traffic circle, Nisour Square, and are immediately fired upon. And then a car comes through the stopped traffic, and they believe it's a car bomb. They fire at it, they neutralize the threat, and then one of their vehicles is disabled. They tow it out, go back to the green zone, don't think anything about it, because this sort of thing happens every day in Iraq.
Another day on the job in Iraq. I was in Iraq 05, 06. Encountered situations just like this. Split-second decisions, violence happened fast, enemy using nasty tactics.
Huh, that's odd. From what Gina Keating is saying, it seems like there isn't even any space where these people could have theoretically acted criminally. They enter a square, are fired upon, and take out a car that they believe to be a car bomb. Apparently, this happened every single day in Iraq, and the Fox News host even reiterates that he encountered situations just like this. Nothing out of the ordinary, it would seem. What gets more interesting, though, is when you realize what's omitted, because Gina Keating does not say that the car they believe to be a car bomb was not a car bomb, but was driven by a 19-year-old medical student. And if you're unfamiliar with this fateful day in Iraq, this is where you probably suspect there's something fishy about this story as it's presented, and you would be right to do so. Because this everyday occurrence that there is definitely nothing special about went down in history as the Nisour Square Massacre, which Gina Keating calls the Nisour Square Incident on their podcast, by the way. In short, what Gina Keating described as neutralizing the threat ended with the death of 17 Iraqi civilians, one among them a 9-year-old boy who died of a gunshot wound to the head. None of that is mentioned in this segment. In fact, you could come away from this not even being aware that there were any victims, besides the 4 noble mercenaries, of course. So just for the record, Gina Keating's account of this massacre is greatly skewed to make the people in question look innocent. For instance, the claim that the Blackwater mercenaries were immediately fired upon entering Nisour Square does not corroborate with eyewitness accounts and could not be proven in court. Later in the segment, Gina Keating alleges the investigation was outsourced to an Iraqi jihadist, obviously trying to discredit the findings of the Iraqi investigation into the massacre. Unfortunate for her, though, the findings of the investigation done by Iraqi authorities largely match with the findings of an inspection by the US military. Quoting from a Washington Post article, "It was obviously excessive, it was obviously wrong," said the US military official, who spoke on condition of anonymity because the incident remains the subject of several investigations. The civilians that were fired upon, they didn't have any weapons to fire back at them, and none of the IP, that's Iraqi police, or any of the local security forces fired back at them. And while this person wanted to remain anonymous, US Army soldiers arriving at Nisour Square roughly 20 minutes after the massacre paint a similar image. It had every indication of an excessive shooting, said Lieutenant Colonel Mike Tarser, whose soldiers reached Nisour Square 20 to 25 minutes after the gunfire subsided. His soldiers report, based upon their observations at the scene, eyewitness interviews, and discussions with Iraqi police, concluded there was no enemy activity involved and described the shooting as a criminal event. Their conclusions mirrored those reached by the Iraqi government, which has said that Blackwater guards killed 17 people. Tarser said they found no evidence to indicate the Blackwater guards were provoked or entered into a confrontation. "I did not see anything that indicated they were fired upon." He also said it appeared several drivers had made U-turns and were moving away from Nisour Square when their vehicles were hit by gunfire from Blackwater guards. So it appears Gina Keating is lying, which she is in an exceptionally disgusting way, if I may say so. But if she was pushed to explain what she is basing her account on, it would most likely be the findings in a leaked report by the US State Department, and this report actually did state that the Blackwater contractors were fired upon by 8 to 10 people, partially disguised as civilians shortly after entering Nisour Square. Strangely, this report doesn't speak of any civilian casualties or injuries, and given that the report apparently was drafted on the same day as the shooting took place, it being based on a thorough investigation seems, let's say, unlikely. So why would the State Department draft this report? Seems somewhat unprofessional until you realize that this leaked report was written by a different Blackwater contractor and is not based on an official investigation by the US government. And we'll get back to the State Department's role in this later, but now let's listen to the next attempt to convince Fox News viewers that there's some conspiracy at play here.
Initially, they were exonerated from this, am I correct?
Oh, yes, and a scathing 90-page opinion. A federal judge that President Clinton appointed to the bench talked about all of the prosecutorial misconduct that happened and the withholding of the evidence and how the defendant's civil rights were violated.
Again, getting back to one of the themes of this video, what is important is what producer Michael Flaherty is not saying in his statement here and what information he chooses to give us. Initially, the case was dismissed by a judge appointed by Bill Clinton in a scathing report detailing misconduct on part of the prosecutors. What he does not really reveal is why the case was dismissed. The way he presents this as will lead you to believe these people are being framed for crimes they didn't commit. In reality, the case was not thrown out because it was demonstrable that these defendants didn't commit a crime, but because of something else. As part of this indictment, the government prosecutors introduced statements given by the involved Blackwater contractors to the State Department directly after the shooting. Now, normally, when a group of people is being questioned for gunning down 17 unarmed civilians, they are informed that they have the right to remain silent and that everything they say can be used against them. In our case, it was the other way around. These statements were made under the assumption given by the State Department that they wouldn't be used in a court of law. A military law expert by the name of Scott Horton had the following to say about this rather odd practice by the State Department. What the State Department has done in this case is inconsistent with proper law enforcement standards. It is likely to undermine an ultimate prosecution, if not make it impossible. In this sense, the objective of the State Department in doing this is exposed to question. It seems less to be to collect the facts than to immunize Blackwater and its employees. By purporting to grant immunity, the State Department draws itself more deeply into the wrongdoing and adopts a posture vis-à-vis Blackwater that appears downright conspiratorial. This will make the fruits of its investigation a tough sell. And Scott Horton was correct in his assessment. The case was thrown out because the prosecutors could not demonstrate a legitimate reason for using these specific statements, according to the judge. In short, the government has utterly failed to prove that it made no impermissible use of the defendant's statements, or that such use was harmless beyond a reasonable doubt. Accordingly, the court must dismiss the indictment against all defendants. This judge's decision was later overturned, by the way. But anyhow, let me just emphasize that this is now the second time the State Department, which is to say the US government, is involved in questionable activities regarding Blackwater. The reason why I think this is important to note is because Gina Keating and Michael Flaherty do their best to present the sentencing of these 4 Blackwater contractors as some witch hunt by the government, when it's demonstrable that actions by the State Department have actually benefited them and arguably prevented an earlier sentencing. Here's what the House Oversight Committee wrote about the line of action by the State Department in an investigation regarding Nisour Square. In cases involving the death of Iraqis, it appears that the State Department's primary response was to ask Blackwater to make monetary payments to put the matter behind us rather than to insist upon accountability or to investigate Blackwater personnel for potential criminal liability. After this investigation, the State Department's Inspector General was forced to resign because he was accused of interfering with investigations regarding Blackwater. To pretend this state headed out for our 4 Blackwater contractors is preposterous. For most of the occupation of Iraq, private military contractors were even completely immune from prosecution in Iraq and thus held to a much lower standard than regular US soldiers. And you can guess 3 times which company was tasked with protecting State Department diplomats in Iraq. Last clip from this Fox News segment, and then we'll turn towards something else.
So they're making tough calls in the battlefield. Today, though, however, 3 of the 4, and soon to be 4, are in jail for 30 years, convicted by a civilian court. Part of the reason that happened is Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton stepped in when there was politics being played about Iraq. Here's a portion of what former Vice President Biden said at the time. Watch.
Let me take this opportunity to express my personal regret, excuse me, for the violence in Nisour involving Blackwater employees in 2007. The United States is determined to hold accountable anyone who commits crimes against the Iraqi people. While we fully respect the independence and integrity of the U.S. judicial system, we were disappointed by the judge's decision to dismiss the indictment. Today, I'm announcing that the United States government will appeal this decision.
So it's called Raven 23, but you could call them the Biden 4 because of political negotiations, President Biden and others reopened this case and made these guys vulnerable.
So, despite the State Department repeatedly acting to the benefit of Blackwater contractors and the United States denying Iraq to put these men on trial, because it happened there and the victims were Iraqi citizens, Joe Biden vowing to appeal the previous ruling is supposedly evidence that this case is just a chip in a political poker game. Sadly, we don't even get an explanation why Biden would want to appeal the case. Fox just shows him saying that they are disappointed and that they will appeal. Now, it's not that Biden didn't give a reason. Maybe you noticed that little transition effect there in the middle of the clip. It's not unusual for news channels to cut out parts of a politician's speech so the segment doesn't drag, or because that specific part is not relevant. This is not the case here. Fox News only cut out half of 2 highly relevant sentences. Let's just play the relevant part back to back and you'll see what I mean.
We were disappointed by the judge's decision to dismiss the indictment. Today, I'm announcing that the United States government will appeal this decision.
And now let's watch the uncut version of what he said.
We were disappointed by the judge's decision to dismiss the indictment, which was based on the way in which some evidence had been acquired. A dismissal, I want to make clear, is not an acquittal. And today, I'm announcing that the United States government will appeal this decision.
This is probably the most obvious giveaway that Fox News and the guests in the segment want to point their audience in a specific direction. Sometimes that's unavoidable when reporting on a set of objective facts, but it's clear that the viewer shouldn't even be introduced to the idea that this conviction might be the result of a legitimate atrocity. Also, that Joe Biden, who was an ardent supporter of the Iraq War, is now this anti-American figure doing the bidding of the Iraqi government is absurd. I talk a lot about events being dishonestly framed on this channel, but the extent here is honestly some next level stuff. There are plenty of legitimate reasons to detest Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden, but Fox News isn't going for legitimate critique here. They want the viewer to come away from this thinking Joe Biden wanted to lock up 4 highly decorated veterans just because. In fact, that the first court didn't clear the Blackwater contractors of wrongdoing but threw out the case because of the prosecution's alleged misconduct stays omitted in this entire segment. Now we're going to put Fox News to the side for a second and talk about the Nisour Square Massacre and how it happened. Descriptions of graphic violence ahead, folks. The story of what is also called Iraq's Bloody Sunday is partially the story of Blackwater, which originally started out as a small company in the swamps of North Carolina, but by the time its employees committed the massacre at Nisour Square had become a frightening new face of the US war machine. Now, in my mind, the relevant history of this company starts with a speech by the US Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld warning of a great new enemy for the United States. The topic today is an adversary that poses a threat, a serious threat to the security of the United States of America. With brutal consistency, it stifles free thought and crushes new ideas. It disrupts the defense of the United States and places the lives of men and women in uniform at risk. Perhaps this adversary sounds like the former Soviet Union, but that enemy is gone. Our foes are more subtle and implacable today. You may think I'm describing one of the last decrepit dictators of the world, but their day too is almost past and they cannot match the strength and size of this adversary. Now, what Rumsfeld is warning of in such a dramatic way isn't Al-Qaeda or Saddam Hussein, but bureaucracy, and this was his way of announcing the sweeping privatization of the US Department of Defense. What is perhaps the most important thing about this speech is when it was held, that being September 10th, 2001, one day before the 9/11 attacks. To cut things short, the ensuing war on terror was a welcome opportunity for Rumsfeld as well as others to privatize the war business, and what followed was a new gold rush for private companies providing services usually left to the military. And few of these companies had such a meteoric rise as Blackwater and its founder Eric Prince, who is a rabid Christian fundamentalist, by the way. And when I say meteoric rise, I'm not exaggerating. According to an investigation by the Congressional Oversight Committee, Blackwater had about $737,000 in federal contracts in 2001. By 2006, that number had risen to $593 million, so about an increase of 80,000% in 5 years. Coalition of the willing? More like coalition of the billing, am I right? In the summer of 2007, there were actually more private military contractors on behalf of the US government in Iraq than actual US soldiers. When it comes to Blackwater, they were mostly tasked with protecting US diplomats going from point A to point B, and here's where we get to the massacre at Nisour Square. The account you're going to hear from me is largely based on the work of investigative journalist Jeremy Scahill, who wrote multiple articles as well as a book on Blackwater. On September 16, 2007, a Blackwater convoy entered Nisour Square shortly after 12 p.m., seeking to clear the congested intersection so a US diplomat could pass through. Nearby Iraqi police officers direct the traffic to stop, including a white sedan, driven by a young medical student named Ahmed with his mother Mahasin in the passenger seat. According to the Blackwater contractors, the white sedan aggressively approached their convoy and did not react to hand signs, a claim contradicted by scores of eyewitnesses. One of the present Iraqi police officers named Ali Khalaf Salman remembers the Blackwater convoy coming to an abrupt halt, and the gun on top of the vehicle marked with a little 4 on this reconstruction began to fire his weapon, quote, randomly. In this moment, police officer Salman looks towards Yarmouk Street, sees the white sedan with the busted windshield, and hears a woman screaming, my son, and runs towards the car. Another police officer nearby named Sahan Tiab also runs to the sedan, wanting to help the people inside. I saw the left side of his head was destroyed, and his mother was crying out, my son, help me, help me. Officer Khalaf now raises his left arm to signal the Blackwater convoy to stop shooting. As of this moment, Ahmed's dead body is still in the driver's seat, perhaps with his foot on the accelerator, and while the 2 police officers are standing next to the car, it begins to roll forward. It is also noteworthy that this sedan had an automatic transmission, which is why the engine didn't immediately stall. Quoting from Jeremy Scahill's book directly now. Don't shoot, please, Khalaf recalled yelling, but as he stood with his raised hand, Khalaf says, a gunman from the 4th Blackwater vehicle opened fire on the mother gripping her son and shot her dead before Khalaf's and Tiab's eyes. I saw parts of the woman's head flying in front of me blow up, Tiab said. They immediately opened heavy fire at us. Within moments, Khalaf says so many shots had been fired at the car from big machine guns that it exploded, engulfing the bodies inside in flames, melting their flesh into one. Each of their 4 vehicles opened heavy fire in all directions. They shot and killed everyone in cars facing them and people standing on the street, Tiab recalled. When it was over, we were looking around and about 15 cars had been destroyed, the bodies of the killed strewn on the pavements and road. Witnesses described a terrifying scene of indiscriminate shooting by Blackwater guards. It was a horror movie, said Khalaf. It was catastrophic, said Zina Fatih, a 21-year-old pharmacist who survived the attack. So many innocent people were killed. Another Iraqi police officer on the scene, Hussam Abdul Rahman, said that the people who attempted to flee their vehicles were targeted. Whoever stepped out of his car was shot at immediately, he said. I saw women and children jump out of their cars and start to crawl on the road to escape being shot, said Iraqi lawyer Hassan Jabbar Salman, who was shot 4 times in the back during the incident. But still, the firing kept coming and many of them were killed. I saw a boy of about 10 leaping in fear from a minibus. He was shot in the head. His mother was crying out for him. She jumped out after him, and she was killed. The last eyewitness account we're going to take a look at is from Mohammed Abdul Razak, who is the father of the 9-year-old boy who was killed in the shooting. We were 6 persons in the car, me, my son, my sister and her 3 sons. He recalled that the Blackwater forces had gestured stop, so we all stopped. It's a secure area, so we thought it will be the usual. We would stop for a bit as convoys pass. Shortly after that, they had opened heavy fire randomly at the cars with no exception. I told everyone to get their heads down. I could hear the children screaming in fear. When the shooting stopped, I raised my head and heard my nephew shouting at me, Ali is dead, Ali is dead. My son was sitting behind me. He was shot in the head and his brains were all over the back of the car. When I held him, his head was badly wounded, but his heart was still beating. I thought there was a chance and I rushed him to the hospital. The doctor told me that he was clinically dead and the chance of his survival was very slim. 1 hour later, Ali died. After this, Razak returned to Nisour Square to collect pieces of his son's head and buried them in the Shiite holy city of Najaf. I'm sorry we had to go through this in such excruciating detail, but now you might have an idea of what hides behind Gina Keating's statement when she says, neutralized the threat. So what happened at Nisour Square? Only the people involved will ever truly know, but if we go by what multiple United States juries went by, Nicholas Slatton acted recklessly in firing his gun from one of the Blackwater trucks at the sedan, which didn't pose a threat to him or anyone else. His colleagues, like the turret gunner, panicked and started firing at everything that moved out of the fear of becoming the target of an attack by insurgents. According to some eyewitnesses, there were attempts by at least one of the contractors to get his colleagues to stop firing, and the words "cease fire" were allegedly yelled multiple times, but seemingly to no effect. As our Fox News host says, sometimes in war, you have to make split-second decisions, but judging from aerial pictures taken of Nisour Square, we can see that the white sedan didn't even reach the square when it came to a standstill, so after Nicholas Slatton had already fired his gun and the car started moving forward. Now, why did he act so recklessly, you might ask? Well, why don't we read a short paragraph from the court documents of United States versus Slatton from September 2019. Sufficient evidence shows Slatton intended to kill Al-Rubiai, that's the driver of the white sedan. Immediately after the shooting, Slatton gloated he popped a man's grape and watched him slump forward. Other witnesses characterized Slatton's reaction to the shootings as defiant and chest-beating, and recalled him high-fiving and backslapping other team members. In private, Slatton mused something was wrong with him since he did not feel remorseful. Those comments echoed Slatton's history of animus towards Iraqi civilians. Slatton once declared Iraqi lives are not worth anything, they are not even humans, they are animals. A convoy member recounted Slatton firing without provocation on multiple instances and openly encouraging teammates to shoot at innocuous targets. Thanks to these efforts, Slatton boasted he was well on his way to getting payback for 9/11, a statement evincing Slatton's determination to kill Iraqis in a twisted hunt for revenge. Slatton's response to these accusations was not to deny them, but to claim they are irrelevant since it was pretty common around his colleagues to hate Iraqis, to which the court replied, "For one, Slatton's anti-Iraqi animus remains relevant, whether unique or unremarkable, since it still tends to make it more likely he killed al-Rubiai. Second, and more importantly, Slatton soft pedals the record. Even among his colleagues, Slatton's hatred for Iraqis stood out. And I don't think I have to add anything to that. Although, in Slatton's defense, maybe hating Iraqis was an unofficial company policy, since Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater, described them as chanting barbarians in his memoir, Civilian Warriors, the inside story of Blackwater and the unsung heroes of the War on Terror. Unsung heroes. After Nisour Square, Blackwater underwent a PR campaign to, be less of a stand-in for war criminals, during which they changed the name and logo of the company several times. They also released a video game for the Xbox 360, and no, that video game didn't turn out to be Spec Ops: The Line. But a Kinect game in which you, yes you, can dive into the experience of being a Blackwater mercenary. In a review of the game for Giant Bomb, Alex Navarro writes, Blackwater feels, for all intents and purposes, like a public relations blast. It's less a video game than an attempt to try and sway the public opinion, at least insofar as the public opinion relates to gamers, back to their side, presenting them as a bunch of selfless, good-natured, totally not mercenaries, who save hostages and deliver foods, and totally don't kill civilians. How could they when there are literally no civilians anywhere in the game? I also love the sentence, if you buy Blackwater, the terrorists don't win, however the next step below terrorists, mercenaries, do. Ultimately, Eric Prince sold the company, but he is far from being out of the mercenary business. As The Intercept reported in May 2019, his offerings range from the traditional mercenary toolkit, military hardware and manpower, to cell phone surveillance technology and malware, to psychological operations and social media manipulation in partnership with shadowy operations like James O'Keefe's Project Veritas. Prince has good connections to the Trump administration, being the brother of Betsy DeVos, current United States Secretary of Education, and he himself is a political advisor to Trump. There isn't that much money to be made off the Iraq war now, though, so he switched his focus to trying to privatize the still ongoing US involvement in Afghanistan. According to an op-ed he wrote, his pitch for the country is based on the historical model of the British East India Company employing a viceroy in charge of the country. Now I know this sounds bad, but it gets worse. According to a leaked presentation published by BuzzFeed News, Prince's idea to make his plan profitable is to exploit the country's large rare earth deposits, which according to him offer a value of up to $1 trillion. Really gotta admire the transparency though, because this is some real movie villain stuff. Not that exploiting a country for resources hasn't been US policy before, but being that open about it and framing it explicitly as a colonialist endeavor is remarkable. Anyway, speaking of the Trump administration, here's where we get to why this is all even relevant and why I wanted to make this video. There's a reason Fox News gives a platform to this podcast and why conservative news sites like the National Review are now publishing articles arguing for the pardoning of these convicted war criminals. It is because with Trump in the White House, they have a chance for these guys to walk free. Trump has already pardoned other Americans convicted of war crimes, and the case of Nicholas Slatton, the first one to fire at Nisour Square, is among multiple cases the White House has requested to evaluate for potential pardon. So I kinda want to get ahead of the narrative here. It is true that the conviction of Nicholas Slatton and his colleagues took a long time due to a number of mistrials and other delays, none of which speak to their innocence though. When this case was presented to a jury, they repeatedly reached a decision that Slatton is guilty of murder and his colleagues of manslaughter. He can call himself a prisoner of war in his own country all he wants. The truth is that, as judge and Vietnam War veteran Royce Lambert put it, the jury got this one exactly right. This was murder. Another aspect when it came to making this video was that it seems like the Iraq war is undergoing this intellectualization at the moment, where the judgment in the mainstream is either the war was justified or the war was a mistake. Words like atrocity or any kind of analysis that centers the Iraqi people is almost completely missing from mainstream discourse. And you've seen this play out, where some analyst says the Iraq war was a horrible mistake, it destabilized the region, gave rise to ISIS, etc. But they don't go the rest of the way in admitting that the main victims of US policy on Iraq have been innocent people. And not just after the invasion, but before that due to sanctions under Bill Clinton and other means. It's judged in a very detached and analytical manner, calculating the pros and cons for the United States. And this understanding of the Iraq war as a mistake at best is another reason why this podcast has been given a place on one of America's biggest news networks. Because the implication is that we, Western nations, act upon countries like Iraq, and if it's the other way around, like is the case for Nicholas Slatton and others, something must be afoul. So that's the political side to the motivation for this video. The other one is rather personal because I could not get the wording that Gina Keating used to describe the Nisour Square Massacre out of my head.
They neutralize the threat.
And she didn't misspeak here. She used the same wording in a different segment a couple of weeks earlier. So far, a lot of space on their podcast has been given to the family members of the Blackwater contractors. They talk about how much they suffer because their partner, son, or brother has been put in prison and get very emotional. And I can't really blame them for how they feel, since it's probably horrifying if a person you hold dear is involved in the killing of over a dozen innocent people. What is absolutely worth condemnation, though, is Gina Keating's and Michael Flaherty's decision to make this the center point of their version of the Nisour Square Massacre. In the so far released episodes or the already aired Fox News segments, not a single victim is given even a sentence of remembrance. They seemingly don't matter in this story, but I think they do. For instance, not only was the driver of the white sedan a medical student, but both his parents were doctors. They could have left the country if they wanted to, but decided against it because they felt they were needed there. I can't talk about all of the victims here, but I'll leave some links in the description to interviews with the father of Ali Kanani and others, so that you can hear their stories. So when you hear the story the next time, be it on Fox News, other conservative outlets, or through a pardon by Trump, keep in mind that the real tragedy here are the people left dead or maimed on the streets of Baghdad, so they don't end up becoming background characters in supposedly everyday occurring events. Thank you for watching, everyone. I don't really have an outro for this one, but I have to keep talking a bit so the credits can roll by. I'm very sorry for mispronouncing some of the Iraqi names, which I'm sure I did, but I did my best. If you want to be part of these credits, you can head over to Patreon via the link in the description. I also started uploading some content limited to patrons recently, which are mostly commentary tracks. Sometimes there are things I'd love to talk about in a video, but which don't end up making the cut, so that's what these Patreon videos are for. As usual, you can hit me up on Twitter or Instagram if you have a question, and yeah, that's all for today. I hope to see you the next time. Have a good one.